you see Jesus? I mean, through the smog of your circumstances, can you see Jesus? Through the thick clouds of issues that tend to surround us from one day to the next, can you see Jesus? Can I just take a moment to share with you the situation that is at hand? Matthew presents Jesus from the perspective of king. We've talked about that since we've been traveling through Matthew and moving from one chapter to the next. Unlike some of the other gospel writers who would present Jesus from other perspectives and emphasize other angles of his deity, Matthew presents him as the king. And because he presents him as the king, it affects the way that Matthew even starts as he opens up this gospel, presenting his genealogy. Shows him and presents him from his connection down from Abraham, moves him up through David, king, and ultimately arrives at the place where the King of the Jews is born. King of kings and Lord of lords. The kingdom that Jesus is setting up for his people is a universal kingdom. It's a kingdom that is not bounded by geographical limitations. It knows no end. However, those on earth who were able to embrace the coming of the Messiah were a bit selfish about it. And because of their inner selfishness, they wanted Jesus to set up his kingdom right then and there on earth. And if they needed to, they wanted to forcefully try to make Jesus king right then and there. John, in his reference to this situation, John chapter 6, verse 15, he says this, "Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone." So Jesus, perceiving their plan and their plot to try to get him to set up his kingdom here on earth, which was too small for his kingdom. It was all right for David's reign. It was do fine for Solomon and those who would come after him. But for Jesus, the earth and its territory was not sufficient for the reign that he would ultimately set up for his kingdom. Jesus, and you look at that 22nd verse here in this chapter, Jesus immediately put his disciples into a boat. King James, the New King James rather, says Jesus made them. That word has a great deal of force behind it. Jesus had to constrain the disciples. It shows that there was a sense of reluctance on the part of the disciples to separate themselves from the king. They were reluctant to separate themselves from the Savior, the one who had been getting them out of one jam after the other, the one who had been healing one situation after the other. That Jesus. They could not stand to be separated from him by any time or space. But Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. Told them, go over to the other side. And this situation reflects and sounds a lot like an earlier occasion where Jesus told the disciples that we're going over to the other side. On that instance, Jesus was with them. He found himself a place at the hinder part of the boat and went to sleep. Here, on the other hand, Jesus would find himself spending time alone. He would go up on a mountaintop. And it would be there that Jesus would find himself praying on the mountaintop. On the flip side, we would find the disciples on a boat by themselves. Jesus on a mountain by himself. Now, while they are there in two separate places, a storm arises in the situation with the disciples in this boat. The winds began to stir up the waves, and the waves began to stir up the boat. The boat began to bounce and rock and reel in one way and the other until it created a scenario where the disciples were not comfortable, but they were by themselves. Jesus, he comes from being by himself off of that mountaintop, and he began to come to where they are. Be mindful that they are in the middle of the sea. Jesus comes to them without a boat. He just simply began, with all of his divine deity in play, walk on the water, and he moves in their direction. They had not seen this before. And because they had not seen anything of this nature before, they immediately became terrified. As they were there on that boat, they came to a place where we must ask ourselves this question. If we want to see Jesus, we must first of all ask ourselves the question, can we identify him? If we are to see Jesus in the worst moments that life has to offer us, we've got to be able to identify him in the worst moments that life has to offer us. There's something about a crisis that would alter our vision and alter our perspective in life. When we find ourselves in the midst of a crisis, we can easily become disorientated. Individuals can find themselves in the middle of the sea, and because of their getting into a panic mode, they can find themselves, instead of swimming upward to safety, they can find themselves swimming downward further into the depths of the water, because they get disorientated because of the panic that is facing them from the crisis. And just like that physical dilemma where an individual would swim deeper into the water instead of swimming towards the surface of the water, we sometimes find ourselves swimming away from God instead of swimming closer to God whenever crises come our way. We've got to be careful that we can identify Jesus regardless of what's going on around us. Disciples on this boat that's tossing back and forth, beat up by the wind and the waves. This physical gap created some illusions for them. They began to think that perhaps Jesus was a ghost. It's right there in that 26th verse. Perhaps Jesus was a ghost. Now, I want you to understand, they saw Jesus. But they had a case of mistaken identity when they saw him. It wasn't that Jesus was invisible to them out in the distance over the horizon. No, that was not the issue. They saw Jesus. But in seeing Jesus, they had a case of mistaken identity. They could not recognize Jesus. In their minds, they thought perhaps he was a phantom or some type of spirit being, some ghost or another. And they became troubled, even though they saw Jesus. I want you to let that sink down and soak it in. Because many times in our own personal lives, even though we see Jesus, we have difficulty recognizing Jesus. We become troubled even though Jesus is on the way. Even though Jesus is moving in our direction, we are still trembling in our boots. Rather than finding relief in the presence of Jesus, they became more afraid. They were more afraid as Jesus approached them than they were when they were rocking back and forth in the boat by themselves. They became stressed in the face of their solution. I hope you caught that. In the face of the solution that was right before their eyes, they were stressing out. They were panicking. Because they did not recognize Jesus when he showed up. Now I want you to understand who they were. You already know it, but can I just simply pause here for a quick second? Can I just emphasize this group hung out with Jesus. I mean, they were not foreign and alien to Jesus. I mean, they like us. Some of us grew up in the church. We knew Jesus all our lives. This group hung out with him. They not only hung out with him, but they traveled with him. It was that scenario that we were just faced with when Jesus told them to get on the boat and go to the other side. They were just with him. This group, they were the ones who would get the inside scoop when Jesus would speak in parables. You remember the series of messages we just dealt with. 7 parables, and out of those parables, Jesus would conclude sharing with the public, and then he would draw in his disciples and give them more detail and explanatory information about what he had been talking about to the crowd. And one would think that this group of all people, they would recognize Jesus when he showed up. I mean, this group, you would think, having heard his voice as he would teach them on an ongoing and regular basis, as he would pronounce demons and cast them out, you would think they would recognize him on sight. My brothers and sisters, we would hope that as Jesus presents himself before you and I each day, that we would be able also to identify him. When Jesus shows up in the midst of our crises, in the midst of our teetering boats, that we would be able to identify that Jesus is on the way. That Jesus is walking in our direction, that Jesus is raising his hand, that Jesus is about to speak the word, that Jesus is about to move in our favor. If we would receive a reprieve from our fears, it is imperative that we recognize Jesus. I mean, if we are to have a break from our crises, if we are to have some type of interruption and intervention in what's going on and what's falling apart in our lives, it's crucial that we would see Jesus. Can you see him? Through the fog, through the midnight hours, can you see Jesus? Yeah, through the tears that are falling from our eyes, can we see Jesus? Through the aches and pains that we're feeling when our bodies are not acting right, can we see Jesus? Jesus sees what they're going through as he makes his way across the sea, walking on water. We see in verse 27, immediately Jesus spoke up. He said to them these words, "Be of good cheer. It is I, do not be afraid." I mean, from the distance over the horizon, Jesus knew that they were panicking. Jesus knew that they were making up ghost tales. Yes, and as Jesus was walking in their direction. And he immediately said to them, "It is I." Because of the importance that we would recognize him if we are to get through what we're going through, if we are to get to the other side of our crises. He said, "It is I." You got to remember in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 in order to appreciate what Jesus is speaking into their lives. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Yes, and so he speaks these words into their lives, that they would hear them, that they would believe them, that they would be motivated and encouraged by them. He says, "It is I." Fear is a condition that coexists in association with the unknown. That's what motivates fear. That's what causes fear to crop up and grow in our lives, is that which we don't know. When we don't know the answer, when we don't know the end, when we can't see down the road, when we can't see around the corner. I mean, that's why our heart begins to pound and race when we find ourselves in a dark alley. We don't know what's down there. That unknown and uncertainty in life causes us to freak out. It causes us to panic and have attacks because we're not sure what tomorrow will bring. I mean, you look at what's going on in the world with this coronavirus. You see a connection, don't you? I mean, if fear is associated to the unknown, and this is the first time that COVID-19 has showed itself in this fashion. I mean, to the extent that they don't even yet have a cure, an antidote, a vaccine. They don't have those things yet. They're working on it, trying to break down its genetic code and all of those things so that they can come up with a formula. But because they don't have it, the unknown. How long is this thing going to hang around? I mean, the flu has killed thousands already. But we know the flu. Pneumonia can devastate us, keep us down, but we know the pneumonia. Can I get a witness? It's the unknown that causes us to empty the shelves in the supermarket. It's the unknown that causes us to feel afraid, even when there is nothing chasing us. It's the unknown that would cause us to wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. It's the unknown. Whatever is unknown to us, we ought to be reminded that it's not unknown to God. Can I just simply bring it to where we sit today? That while this new strain of the coronavirus is unknown to us, it's not unknown to the Lord. Yes. Can you see Jesus? Yes, in the midst of a coronavirus epidemic, pandemic that's breaking out around the world, can you see him? Yes, when he began to walk in our direction on our sea of life, yes, can we identify him, or is it that we would mistake him for any old body? Can I ask you one more question? Can you see Jesus? Can you see him? Brother Norwood waving you on. Can you see Jesus off over the horizon, Brother Moore, just beckoning your way? Look at verse 28. Peter gives the Lord a test and winds up getting tested. Can I get a witness? And verse 28 says, and Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you. Gives him this conditional statement, if then, parallel. If it is you, then let me see what you're working with. Can I get a witness? Yes. You command me to come where you are. I mean, I know Jesus. I've been walking with Jesus and talking with Jesus and listening to Jesus. If it's you, I want you to command me that I would come to you right now against the laws of physics and science, against the laws of nature. I want you to command me to step out of this boat and walk on water as if I was walking on the ground. Gives him this test. Lo and behold, Jesus responds and says to him, come here, Peter. Jesus has a way of doing that to us. Yes, in the midst of our crisis, when we are feeling vulnerable and weak, Jesus would beckon us to come to him to find the answer to our dilemma in life, to find out how we can trust him more in the midst of our uncertainties. Come here. Verse 29, Peter got down out of the boat. And as long as he was listening to Jesus, he was doing all right. It says, Peter inquisitions Jesus with this test, but now Jesus says, it's your turn, Peter. By faith, I want you to come down and begin to take one step at a time in my direction. Is there anybody here who's willing to get out of your boat of safety, even though it's rocking, even though the wind is causing the waves to beat up on your boat? How many of you are willing to get out of that boat, the only form of safety that you can have in your possession, to walk on water? Because Jesus said so. Well, I'm not going to wait for an answer to that one. But as you ponder it in your mind and think about it as you travel down the course of this week, let's look at how Peter handled it. He says to Peter, "Come." Peter gets out of the boat and he begins to walk on the water and go in the direction of Jesus. Yes, in faith, Peter walked. In faith, Peter did what was miraculous, and the laws of nature and science said it was not possible. When all that Peter could see was Jesus, Peter walked. Catch that. When Jesus was in his view, not only in his headlines, but in his peripheral view, yes, Peter was doing all right. Yes, Peter was making progress while his vision was fixed on Jesus. Peter was moving towards him. Yes, but my brothers and sisters, as the distance was closing between Peter and Jesus, something happened, which leads to another question. Can you see Jesus through your circumstances? Wind's blowing. The waves are still tossing around. That did not bother Peter at first because he had his eyes fixed on Jesus. But now, all of a sudden, his circumstances began to get the best of him, and he takes his eyes off of Jesus. He stops trusting long enough to start sinking. When we take our eyes off of Jesus for however brief of a moment, yes, we stop standing and start sinking. When we take our eyes off of Jesus, however briefly, we stop making progress and we start losing ground. When we take our eyes off of Jesus, the text begs of us to keep our attention and our focus on Jesus. You get nothing else, make sure that you write it down in your remembrance, that when the next crisis hit, when the next winds began to beat about your boat, don't you stop looking at Jesus. I know the circumstances would say, stay home, don't you dare go to church. I know your circumstances would say, don't pray, don't worry Jesus about this thing or that thing. Your circumstances would say, you don't have time to consult the scriptures. You're too tired. Your eyes are too heavy. You're sleepy. You got a long day tomorrow. You got to get up early. Yes, don't bother with Jesus. But the text begs of you and me that we would keep that much more focused on Jesus when the storms of life are raging. Can you see Jesus through your circumstances? Verse 30 says, but when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out. He went back to where he started, and that was a place of fear. When he took his eyes off of Jesus, all the ground that he had made, all the progress, all the forward movement was for naught when he took his eyes off of Jesus. And he began to sink. He became afraid once again. Peter, come back to class. Peter, you failed this test, but come back to class. We can retake, we got a makeup exam for you, Peter. Come on back to class. Now, Peter was a fisherman. He was used to being out on boats. Peter was also a good swimmer. He was used to being in the water. But Peter allowed his circumstances to take his eyes off of what he had in front of him, and that was Jesus the Christ. Life can sometimes do that to us. Life can sometimes, with its evilness, cause us to take our eyes off of Jesus. Life, with its epidemics, sometimes cause us to take our eyes off of Jesus. Sometimes life, with all of its rushing moments of do this and go here and accomplish that, can cause us to take our eyes off of Jesus long enough to make us afraid. Yes. Sometimes we allow our fear and circumstances to control us rather than us controlling our circumstances. God gives us the power to change our circumstances. The question is whether or not we're willing to walk in victory or to succumb to the pressure that's in front of us. And rather than us mastering our circumstances, we allow them to mold us and to shape us. When we're not trusting Jesus, we are sinking right in front of Jesus. I mean, he's still there. Jesus never sank in the water. Jesus never lost his footing. He's still there. But right in front of Jesus, Peter began to sink. And Jesus looks at Peter. He said, "You had this. You were walking on the water." He says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Why did you invest more time looking at your surroundings than you did looking at your Savior? My brothers and sisters, sometimes we too invest more of our attention on our circumstances than we do on our Christ. Sometimes we allow our negative conditions to take precedent and priority over the solutions that are right in front of our eyes. And Jesus would say to us, as he said to Peter, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" It's not like you've never seen me, heal blinded eyes. It's not like you've never seen me cause the deaf to hear, the dumb to talk. It's not like you've never seen me cast out demons. It's not like you've never seen me do the impossible before. He says, why did you doubt when you were doing so well? My brothers and sisters, God would say to you and I today, why did we take our eyes off of Christ when we were making so much progress, when God was blessing us, when God was keeping us, when God was promoting us, and God was lifting us up and encouraging us? Why did you begin to doubt when God was doing so much on your behalf? Well, about to sit down now. I'm running out of time. Not running out of text, but I'm running out of time. Can I get a witness? Yes. But can I end? Can I end right here? Yes. Look at verse 32. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. I mean, can I give you this on my way to heaven? Can I just leave you with this? Yes, Peter did have sense enough, to call on the right person in the midst of his devastating circumstances. He's sinking and the water is rising above his head, but in the midst of all of that, he had sense enough to say, Lord, save me. Is there anybody who is willing, anybody who's paying attention enough to know that you can call on him even after you messed up, even after you've taken your eyes off of him? You can call on Jesus to save you. When he has no other hope or help to turn to, he calls to that same Jesus he just took his eyes off of, and he says, Lord, save me. And guess what Jesus did? Jesus stretched out his arms, grabbed hold of him, and from the waters lifted him and saved. Can I get a witness? Yes, when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. They were safe. Yes, when they got into the boat, the drama that they were dealing with before was gone. When they got in the boat with Jesus, I stopped by to tell you, I'd rather be with Jesus in a storm-tossed sea than to be on dry land without him. Yes, I'd rather be with Jesus in the midst of my trials and circumstances, in the midst of my problems, in the midst of my ups and downs, than to be without him on dry ground. When they found themselves in the same place, occupying the same territory in the boat with Jesus, everything suddenly became all right. The winds were no longer howling. The waves were no longer beating. When Jesus was there with them in the boat, they began to feel a little bit better and a little bit safer and a little bit more comfortable because Jesus was there. Somebody spoke up and said, can I get the microphone? Yes, they had an instantaneous speak meeting. They began to have testimony service. Somebody would speak up. And they began to gather around Jesus and they began to worship him. And I heard this coming from the crowd. Truly, you are the Son of God. I heard him in the crowd, saying that you are deity, you are divine, you are the Son of the living God. Can I leave this with you? He was the Son before they ever acknowledged it. And he will be the Son long after they acknowledged it. But the point here is not that they are assigning deity to Jesus. Rather it is that they have sense enough to realize that this is no mystical force that's walking towards them. This is no ghost or phantom that is in their midst. This is Jesus. And my brothers and sisters, it would serve us well to realize that on paper we don't have enough to pay our bills, but at the end of the month God make a way out of no way. It would serve us well to say this is the Son of the living God. My brothers and sisters, when everybody else is doubting whether or not we're going to make it or whether or not we survive, and yet 20 years later we're still here, it serves us well to say this is the Son of the living God. When God allowed you to drive the car you drive, live in the house you live in, have the toys you have, you ought to say, thank you, Jesus. This is the Son of the living God. Somebody ought to shout and say hallelujah. Thank you, Lord. Yes, you ought to acknowledge when God is blessing you. You ought to acknowledge when God is healing you. You ought to acknowledge when God is raising you up. You ought to acknowledge when God is showing favor in your life. My brothers and sisters, is there anybody here that know Jesus is a way maker? Anybody here that